Okay, I came here to give a different speech. I was fascinated with the Index for Social Progress, and that was what it was about, and that was the article that came out in the Nordische Zeitung this morning, wasn't it? It was, no, yesterday morning. And then as I heard here everybody talking about the importance of the work that's being done, how the world has again become a mess and we haven't particularly figured it out, I started recognizing a bit of the past, and I have gotten emotionally carried away by all this thing. And so I want to tell you a story about Peru, my country. And it's a story I want to tell you because it has a lot to do with Stefan in the first place. And it has a lot to do with the kind of works he's talking about. In synthesis, it's more or less this. The last time that the West won a war against terrorism and turned the country around completely was roughly between the last years of 1980 and 1990. Since then, the West has spent about $7 trillion fighting in the Middle East, and it hasn't won 1 inch. And we won it in Peru, and I want to say it has a lot to do with Stefan. Everything I'm going to tell you now is the absolute truth backed up by government. Now, when I told this to a couple of friends of mine from Avina, I said, I just can't hold it back. They said, well, Stefan is a discreet person. He's shy. He likes the low profile. And he's going to get angry, or he might get angry. So I thought about it, and I have suffered the wrath of Stefan, but I know when he gets angry, he only does it for about 2 years. He picks up the phone afterwards. So I told myself, let's take a shot. Okay, what did Peru do that has not been heralded? Because you see, what happens when a country's successful, the first people that have to do anything with success are the first ones taken to jail, accused. This is human nature. So it's taken time for the Peruvian story to come out. And it's going to be coming out in different moments, in different places. Just yesterday, the U.S., possibly one of the major candidates on the Republican side for the presidency of the United States, Jeb Bush, mentioned the Peruvian example as an American success story, not realizing that it's really a Swiss story, but we'll talk about that in a while. But he's not the only one. Ron Paul said the same thing. Clinton just recently came out. There's been a couple of articles in the Wall Street Journal, and we're bringing out a book on the story behind the story. But basically, it's this. If you look at that curve, that's Peru since about 1896 until the blue curve starts dying between 88 and 93. Peru was in an absolute mess, 7,600% inflation per year. Its GNP dropped 13.4%. And 60% of Peru in 1990, according to the RAND Corporation, number one military think tank of the United States, and the Department of Defense, at that time foresaw that Lima would fall in 1992, written down verbatim. What the Shining Path was doing, it was a terrorist system, was surrounding the city. And traditionally in my country, the people that live in the city don't care about the countryside, so they didn't even see it coming. But that's what was occurring. Then that happens to coincide with my relationship with Stefan Schmidheiny. So let me tell you the story. Let me tell you a story that I'm going to sum up now as saying that the West, with $7 trillion, wasn't able to win a war, that some Peruvians with Stefan Schmidheiny and $2 million, we won the war. Not only we won the war, Colombia's still at war, many Central American countries are still at war, and we stopped being at war, and I'm going to tell you the story that you'll be able to read in a book and many articles before. I hadn't planned telling you all of this because this is like kind of not for a Swiss audience. It's un peu fort. But I said, if not now, like President Reagan said, when? And if not here, where? So here it comes, that there's another motivation. And the motivation is because I think that there's this judgment in Italy that we all know about that's come out, and Stefan has found a freedom, which is good, but it has not, that freedom isn't justice. Justice still has to be done because they don't understand who they've gone out hitting. And for me, and Stefan knows it, he should have come out hitting a long time ago. So here's what we're going to try and do to encourage something, because I think justice is important. And what happened was essentially this. Stefan was very interested in what we were doing. We talked about the rule of law and property rights. And he was talking, of course, especially about ecology. And I said, well, what do I know about ecology, as we began to know each other? And he was very interested. He invited me over, I think it was 1987, because I had published a book called El Otro Sendero, The Other Path, which indicated what development should be about, but it was also a reference to the terrorist movement. As a matter of fact, I believe I'm the only one that wrote a book against the shining path. But that's because I come from a city called Arequipa, where we are particularly brave. Now, in that thing, Stefan had read it, and he said, I read it, lo he leído en español. And so we started talking about it, and then we started finding coincidences. And the coincidences had to do a lot with also how you studied things. Michael Green, the brilliant presenter of SPI, talked before how in Cromwell's time, there was a man called Petty who had strategies. But there was a second guy in Cromwell's time who was called Sydenham. Sydenham had been recruited by Cromwell because he had a sense of strategy. And in this sense of strategy, he said that the only way you could actually understand what was going on is not just believing the stories of what happened in the past. You had to look at them yourself. And that's a coincidence I have with Stefan, which may have come with a Swiss education I have, which is, I write on squared paper and ask questions until I get to the bottom, of it. And so Sydenham, at the time that he was a medical doctor from Oxford, recruited by Cromwell, and asked to go back to practice medicine, discovered practically the cure for most of the things that afflict us the most: malaria, the cold, a bunch of afflictions. And he did it because he went against all the volumes that existed at the time, which were that the cause of all sicknesses was fevers. I mean, today what we know about a fever is very simple. A fever is simply a manifestation of something else happening. But at that time, they analyzed the symptoms instead of the causes, instead of the real indicators, which is why I'm so interested in SPI. So Stefan came around and said, well, what gives with Peru? And so what we did is we went out and we talked. Stefan has met guerrillas, coca growers, narcotraficantes, and the other side, and he's interviewed them with me one by one. So there's a moment when he gets emotional. He says, Jesus Christ, this isn't what it's supposed to be. Not necessarily the good guys are on one side and the other guys on the other side. What is it that can be done? So what we came as a conclusion was that a lot of the farmers basically wanted to be formal. It was pretty tough, when you're out there and you're a farmer, it's very tough trying to get inside the law. This is, of course, about Egypt, but it's the same thing about Peru. Even Peru, you wanted to create a formal company, it's like Egypt. Egypt, it takes 549 days. This is one document per day, each face here represented. And in the case of Peru, it's about 1,000 days if you want to create a company. That's where these guys were. They couldn't get in. So they were outlaws. So the question is, how do we tell everybody that the responsibility is not the people, but a law that no longer is adapted to reality? Reality always changes, and the law is always 2 steps behind. But in the case of Peru, it was 100 steps behind. And that huge space needed facts and indicators. So what we did is we started finding out all sorts of things. Some things worked and some things didn't. Stefan took it upon himself, brought the top executives of Unilever, Nestle, Hershey, I forget how many agro-industrial companies, brought them together, Peruvian authorities, and said, how do we buy? And how do we get these farmers to do something else than coca here and there just to get on the legitimate side? How can we purchase? Because public corporations don't generally do that. It's private corporations. They're the real guys who do agrarian reform. That's one thing we did. So we started doing other things. Another thing we did, I said, the first thing we got to find out is what these guys want. What is it they need the most? So I remember from my education in Switzerland that the way you Swiss found out is through direct democracy, Vernehmlassung, the referendums, the cost-benefit analysis of the law, the weighting of the constituencies to make sure you got the right vote. If it's about Bern, more people from Bern vote, then you got a geometric approach to the other people. There's this continual thing of the Swiss asking nasty questions, but that tell you what people want. Very simple people. Plus, what's important is you don't oblige, like in my country, everybody to vote. You ask those who want to come. So those who are thinking and have an opinion, come. So the idea of democracy in Switzerland is essentially, democracy is about opinions. So if you don't have an opinion, why should you vote? So in Peru, we get the 80% who doesn't have an opinion coming to vote, and then we get the presidents we have. So we brought all of that in, and I said, who knows the most about it? And then Stefan's people picked out a man called Hans Urs Willi of the Chancellerie Fédérale, who then came to Peru, and we started looking at everything, and we started going to Uchiza, El Valle del Alto Guayaga, and we went out to San Francisco and El Vraim, and they were asked in a systematic, non-survey way, what is it they wanted, and they all said, property. Not property because they already had it. I mean, if you're informal and you got guns, you've got it. Legal property. And so around that idea is that we said, here is the way to go about it. And in effect, taking people at that time, the Secretary General of the United Nations was Javier Pérez de Cuellar, so it was easy to bring on board. And the United States, we started explaining, look, we've got a severe war going on. And the war doesn't just happen because there's agitators, it happens because there's people that are unhappy. And their unhappiness comes from the fact that the things they own, they control, they want, they need to live, to eat, are under danger. And so we've got to go in and find a way to give them title to what they've got. So we found out that in effect the informal sector was organized. The farmers were in 182 committees, and we brought them in. And we brought in people from the State Department, we brought in people from the States, which has enormous influence in my country, like all over Latin America. And we said, these are not paramilitaries like in Colombia. These are Minutemen, like the guys who fought for the US independence. They're poor people fighting for their assets. And so you also have to do what Stefan and I do, which is look at them, talk to them. And took us a year and a half with $2 million from Stefan Schmidt-Heine, because that's what the funds were. There's no funds for this kind of thing elsewhere. I mean, can you see Bill Gates doing this? So what we did is we started the interviews, and we took them all the way to Washington. And we went all the way to the White House. Can I have the next drawing? Next. Next page, please. The book's already written. It's time before it gets there. All right. Now here you've got, on the vertical side are deaths, muertes. These are the Peruvians that are dying from 1980 till 1993. And what you've got are the years weighted down. The shining path appears. That's your top number one column. It is well received by the farmers in Peru until the farmers are told that they have to be collectivized. And they thought they were collectivized. But you see, Peruvian history is all wrong. They've been privatized for a long time. But they're called communes, so everybody confuses them. So by the time they find out what's happening, the shining path starts killing. And there go, that yellow line are the people in the countryside dying. The second picture is the farmers form defense organizations. They don't have guns, so they've got ondas, they've got slings and spears and knives, and some hunting guns that are homemade that go 30 meters. And they manage to bring back, as you see, going back to 1986, the Shining Path back. But the Shining Path then discovers property and sees that there's a lot of people with coca fields, and so we begin to protect the coca fields, and they get power. As they get power, then they are able to win back territory, and there you see the red part. That's when they take over 60% of the territory of Peru. That's when Rand Corporation says, we're probably done. And in Uruguay, the first OAS meetings take place to form a Latin American army to intervene in Peru. It's all written down, by the way. So, 1988, 89 is when we meet up with Stefan. And we start putting all this paperwork together and saying, these guys, it's a terrible war because the Peruvian army is from the coast, and they cannot tell when they're fighting in the Andes who's on whose side. They're blind in the eyes, as the head of the army of peasants told me, y son ciegos de la boca, and they're blind of the mouth because they don't speak Quechua, so they kill indiscriminately. United States, Viet Minh, Viet Cong. But the farmers know everything, but the farmers are illegal. So the whole action that you see with all those blue numbers, where Stefan's money was being spent, went to convince the United States and the international community that these guys were the good guys. As a matter of fact, where you have that picture there in the White House, where I am with Ben Scowcroft and the President of the United States, that's when Bush takes out a note and says, looking at his paper, and says, the little guys are on our side. And at that moment, they get legitimized, and we put 20 articles that say that the little people, informal of Peru, are really the brunt of Peru's population. And at that moment, they also get the right to get weapons, and the Peruvian army goes from 30,000 to 123,000, and we defeat, in 6 months, the Shining Path. And you see that the deaths go down from the very moment that that occurs. And the way that this was done was through property, because, am I extending myself too much? Okay, so you have to tell me, this is cultural. So the thing is, as it starts going down, it was the biggest human rights possible action that you could do. We brought deaths down, because the moment that the army went from 30,000 to 150,000, simply the other part ran away. Abimael Guzman goes to Lima. He's captured alone without a guard because he was defeated a year earlier. What everybody photographed was the capture. He was defeated by the Peruvian peasants, who were correctly identified as informals. And the way they were brought in is through property. Why? And that's why I'm so interested in indicators. Because people, generally speaking, in any developing country, probably with the exception of Costa Rica, don't like the state. The state is a tax man. He's disciplined. He's one of theirs, and he's on the take. So how do you get information so as to govern correctly? Well, if you come in and you say, look, I want to give you what's yours, and I'm going to accept the way the thing is divided, I will compensate afterwards, but I'm going to give you what's yours. But for that, I need your name. I want to know if you're married. I want to know where you live. I want to know what you do. Otherwise, how am I going to give you a good title? He'll tell you everything. And so all of a sudden, we found out what the jungle was composed of, and that's what made us one in 6 months. Because you see, the problems that you are now facing in the Middle East is that you don't know who is where and who's doing what. I mean, the last column I read of Thomas Friedman in the New York Times simply said, we think Al-Qaeda has got somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people. Hey, that's it. Oh, there's the Islamic Army. What did we do? We are now being called, and that's one of the reasons the book is coming out, the books are coming out, It is because the Peruvian experiment is now recognized, or is beginning to be recognized as a classic for fighting informality, for fighting poverty, and for getting rid of violence. When Mohamed Bouazizi set off the Arab Spring, you will recall that he lit himself up. He self-immolated. This is 17th of December 2010 in the fair city of Sidi Bouzid. This man, who supposedly is a worker according to the European press, lights up. And when he lights up, people march on the streets all throughout the Middle East and topple in 2 months, 4 governments. Bang, 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 bang. They go down. Now, what made them go into the streets? Well, knowing what we know about Peru, we sent a team of 3 people. We have stayed there, recruited 27 others, and we stayed in the region for another 3 years. And we found out that when Mohamed Bouazizi lit up, he wasn't alone. He lit up simultaneously with 63 other people. Of the 63 other people, 37 survived because they were extinguished. We interviewed half of them, and it's on a film now in public broadcasting system in the United States called Unlikely Heroes. And they give you the story of why it is that they revolted. Because you see, you don't commit suicide in public with pain if you don't have something to say. So they had lots to say. And just when they were dying, people had microphones and their iPads and their stuff, and they registered. And there wasn't one religious comment and one political comment. They all said, my objective in life is Ras el Mel, which means capital. Now, so much for Piketty. Maybe he's talking about Europe, but he ain't talking about us. Ras el Mel. And they all committed suicide within the week that they were expropriated. The worst thing, they said, is expropriation. I interviewed them all. It takes like 3 years to get everyone to talk, or as many people as he can. There was a moment when I became friendly with one of them, and I said, you know, there must be something in Islam that sort of like forbids suicide. How do you feel about that? He says, of course. That's not the big problem. The big problem is deprivation. It's expropriation. But you see, you wouldn't understand that, he said, because your prophet chased the merchants out of the temple. My prophet was a merchant. Okay. So talking about indicators, you gotta get close to what's happening. According to our calculations, in the Middle East, there are 300 million people living off informal entrepreneurship. And their problem is the law. And their problem is the law that doesn't suit them. And if that isn't factored into your indicators, you may go like Jeffrey Sachs and say, you need fishnets, you need this, you need that. But what happens if they get 1,000, it takes 1,000 days, or in the case of Egypt, 10,000 days to get a permit to build? None of that is gonna help. So it's very important to look at facts straight. Now, I have been looking at the time, but I'm probably way over, so I'm gonna end. Here's the thing. Once you are informed of who is what, you start getting information. Michael, the brilliant presentator of SPI, and I recommend that in spite of hearing him here, you should hear him on TED. He's just as sexy as he was on public. He goes out and he says, what's happened to the crisis of 2008? I'll tell you what's happened in 2008. As a Latin American, it's easy as hell. You don't know where your assets are. $700 trillion of derivatives. And all your banks say, this is the good bank and this is the bad bank. Hey, you look Latin American. Actually, matter of fact, you don't, because our banks have only one's balance sheet. You have special purpose entities. You don't know where it is. United States credit, private credit, is 18% of what it's been in the last 60 years. Why aren't people investing? Because you don't know who's got the debt. So there's nothing like getting the direct information. So there's a tendency of the Jeffrey Sachs and others to think that property came because you ate beef. Property came because you organized society in such a way that you knew who's accountable for what. And once you know who's accountable for what, you can start asking questions. So, to end up, I don't know who would have given us $2 million to find this stuff out and understand it if you weren't really inspired. I remember being with Stefan one time at his house, and he said, "You realize all the risks involved?" And I said, "I'm not going to tell him because I'm not going to get the money if I tell him." And he said, "There's a lot of risk." So I knew he was calculating. So he's careful, he's Swiss, but he went out and did it. And I'm out here telling it. So here's the thing. I think, quite frankly, society has got a debt to you, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm only Peruvian. You see, we're 1/3 of 1% of the world's population. But in my case, you made a hell of a difference, because I would hate to think what had happened if this terrorist movement had actually won over Peru. I think it would have set up an example all throughout the rest of Latin America. And I also believe the other thing, we're all Christians here. Well, some of us are Christians. And the important thing is this: you have to give the other cheek. But giving the other cheek doesn't mean that you don't have justice. And it's payback time. And I think we got to do something about that. Thank you.